The sound of my hammer stopped because someone believed a clipboard was more powerful than the law. Before I tell you how that happened, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA that thought it could control everything, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let me take you back to the Saturday morning that changed the way I looked at my neighborhood forever. My name is Ethan Brooks, and I had lived in Maple Ridge Estates for almost 11 years without a single violation notice. I paid my HOA dues on time, waved to my neighbors every morning, trimmed my lawn every Friday evening, and kept my property cleaner than most homes on my street. I wasn't trying to make a statement that weekend. I was simply replacing the aging wooden railing on my front porch before the loose boards became a safety problem. The old cedar posts had started to split after years of rain and summer heat. I had already stacked fresh pressure-treated lumber beside the driveway the night before. My toolbox sat open on the concrete. A cordless drill rested beside a bright yellow level. The smell of freshly cut wood mixed with the cool morning air while birds filled the neighborhood with the kind of peaceful sounds that usually made Saturdays my favorite day of the week. Around 8 o'clock, I measured the first board, lined it up carefully, and drove the first screw into place. The sharp crack of the impact driver echoed across the quiet street. Before I could reach for the second piece of lumber, I heard another sound. High heels striking concrete with surprising speed. I turned toward the sidewalk and immediately recognized Linda Foster, the president of our HOA. She wasn't smiling. She carried her familiar black clipboard tucked tightly under one arm and walked toward my driveway with the confidence of someone who expected immediate obedience. She didn't wave. She didn't ask what I was doing. She stopped a few feet away, looked directly at the unfinished railing, and folded her arms. "You need to stop right now," she said in a firm voice that carried farther than it needed to. Her words were loud enough for several nearby neighbors to glance outside. A garage door across the street paused halfway open. Someone watering flowers quietly lowered the hose. Another neighbor stepped onto his porch holding a mug of coffee. I rested my drill on the sawhorse and wiped the sawdust from my hands. "Good morning, Linda," I answered as calmly as I could. "Is something wrong?" She glanced at the lumber, then back at me as though I had already admitted to breaking a rule. "Weekend construction isn't allowed here," she declared. "I'm ordering you to stop immediately." Her tone wasn't emotional. That almost made it worse. She sounded completely certain, as if the conversation had already ended before I spoke. I looked around the street once more. Every pair of eyes seemed fixed on my driveway. My hammer lay beside the new railing, untouched. For the first time that morning, I had the uneasy feeling that this wasn't just about a porch repair. Something much bigger had just begun. Linda didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The silence from everyone watching made her words sound even heavier. She took one more step onto my driveway, lifted her black clipboard, and tapped the page with the end of her pen. "Weekend exterior construction requires HOA approval," she said. "You don't have it." I looked at the half-removed porch railing, then back at her. "This isn't new construction," I replied evenly. "I'm replacing damaged boards before someone gets hurt." She didn't acknowledge my explanation. Instead, she glanced toward the gathering audience across the street, almost as if she appreciated having witnesses. "That's not your decision to make," she answered. "You'll need to submit an architectural review request and wait for approval before touching anything else." I couldn't help noticing the contradiction. If my porch had become unsafe, waiting several weeks for paperwork didn't make much sense. But I also knew arguing on the sidewalk rarely solved anything. "Can you show me where that rule is written?" I asked. For the first time, her expression tightened slightly. It lasted only a second before she regained her confidence. "I don't need to carry the governing documents everywhere I go," she replied. "As HOA president, I'm informing you of the rule." That answer caught my attention more than her accusation. During 11 years in Maple Ridge Estates, every genuine rule had always been easy to reference. Board members usually quoted article numbers or section headings. Linda didn't mention either. She simply expected everyone to accept her authority without question. Before I could respond again, she reached into a large envelope tucked beneath the clipboard. My stomach sank as she pulled out a bright orange violation notice. She walked directly to my front door and carefully taped it beside the handle where anyone passing by could see it. The fluorescent paper almost glowed against the white trim of the house. Across the street, I noticed Mr. Henderson quietly lower his coffee mug. A young couple walking their dog slowed their pace without pretending they weren't watching. Even the landscaping crew working 2 houses down stopped their leaf blower for a moment. Linda stepped back to admire the notice as though she had completed an official ceremony. Effective immediately, she announced. All construction activity must cease. Continued work may result in daily fines and additional enforcement actions. She said every word slowly enough for the neighbors to hear. My tools remained exactly where I had left them. The cordless drill rested on the sawhorse beside the fresh lumber. Sunlight reflected off the metal bits scattered across my workbench, making the unfinished project look strangely abandoned. I folded my arms, not out of anger, but to keep myself from reacting emotionally. I'll review the documents, I told her. If there's a rule, I'll follow it. Linda gave a satisfied nod, convinced the conversation had ended in her favor. That's the smart decision, she replied before turning toward the sidewalk. As she walked away, several neighbors quietly disappeared back inside their homes. The street slowly returned to normal, but it didn't feel normal anymore. I peeled the violation notice from my front door and read every line twice. It referenced an HOA restriction, yet something felt incomplete. There was no article number, no bylaw citation, no specific section, just broad language and a warning. Standing there with the paper in my hands, I realized I wasn't wondering whether I had broken a rule anymore. I was beginning to wonder whether the rule existed at all. I carried the orange violation notice into my kitchen and laid it flat on the dining table. Sunlight from the back window stretched across the paper, making the bold lettering stand out even more. At first glance, it looked official enough to intimidate anyone. It listed potential daily fines, possible hearings, and vague references to community standards. But the more I read, the more one detail kept bothering me. It never identified the actual rule I had supposedly violated. There was no article number, no section, no amendment date, and no citation pointing me toward the governing documents. It simply stated that weekend exterior construction required prior HOA approval. I had spent enough years working as a project manager to know that legitimate policies usually referenced specific language. General statements without supporting documentation always deserved a second look. I walked into my home office and opened the filing cabinet where I kept every document I had received since buying the house. Closing papers, insurance records, property surveys, annual HOA meeting packets, budget reports, election ballots. I even kept old newsletters because I disliked throwing away paperwork that might matter later. After a few minutes, I found the thick binder containing the declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, along with the bylaws and architectural guidelines. I carried everything back to the table, made a fresh pot of coffee, and started reading from the beginning instead of searching for shortcuts. The clock on the microwave quietly ticked through the morning while pages turned one after another. Outside, I could occasionally hear lawn mowers and children riding bicycles, reminders that everyone else had returned to enjoying their Saturday. Nearly an hour passed before I reached the section covering exterior modifications. It explained when homeowners needed architectural approval for additions, fences, detached structures, swimming pools, roof replacements, and significant design changes. I read the paragraph twice. Then I read it a third time. Nothing mentioned replacing damaged porch railings with materials matching the existing design. I flipped ahead to maintenance responsibilities. That section actually required homeowners to keep exterior features in safe condition. Again, there was nothing about prohibiting repairs on weekends. Thinking perhaps I had overlooked a later amendment, I searched through every packet the HOA had mailed over the past decade. New landscaping policies, parking updates, holiday decoration guidelines, trash collection reminders, pet registration changes. Not one document introduced the restriction Linda had confidently announced in front of the neighborhood. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the violation notice again. The wording suddenly felt less convincing than it had an hour earlier. If the rule existed, why wasn't it referenced anywhere? If the board had approved it, where was the amendment? Why had no previous newsletter mentioned such a significant limitation? Questions replaced frustration. That was a much better position to be in. Frustration makes people react. Questions make people investigate. I opened my laptop and logged into the HOA homeowner portal, expecting to find a digital copy of the governing documents or perhaps an updated rulebook. Instead, I found the exact same documents already sitting on my dining table. Nothing more. No supplemental policy. No weekend construction regulation. As I compared the online files with the orange notice one final time, one sentence kept repeating in my mind. Linda had never shown me the rule because she never actually pointed to one. And for the first time since she walked onto my driveway, I began to suspect that the most important document in this entire dispute might not belong to the HOA at all. I had spent half the morning searching through HOA documents, and all I had found was one important fact. The rule Linda claimed existed simply wasn't there. But another thought had started bothering me. The violation notice kept referring to construction. Even though I wasn't adding anything to my property, I was replacing damaged railings with the same dimensions, the same layout, and nearly identical materials. If the HOA couldn't explain its own authority, maybe the answer wasn't in the HOA documents at all. Maybe it belonged somewhere else. I opened my county's property records website first, then followed the link to the city's building department. Within minutes, I found a page explaining the difference between maintenance, repair, remodeling, and structural additions. The language was far more precise than anything I'd seen from the HOA. Repairs intended to restore an existing feature generally fell under maintenance unless structural elements were significantly altered. Curious, I downloaded the city's residential repair guide and kept reading. Halfway through the document, I found a section about exterior porch repairs. It explained when permits were required, when inspections were necessary, and which projects homeowners could complete themselves. My project fell into a gray area because I was replacing several load-bearing railing posts. That meant one thing. If anyone's approval mattered, it wasn't Linda's. It was the city's. I grabbed my folder of home records and searched through the closing documents until I found another envelope I hadn't opened in years. Inside were copies of previous permits pulled by the former homeowner for electrical work and roof replacement. That reminded me something else could be verified. I logged into the city's online permit portal and entered my property address. The system returned every permit associated with my house going back nearly 20 years. Roof replacement, water heater installation, HVAC upgrade. Then I noticed an option to begin a new residential repair application entirely online. I read every instruction carefully before completing it. The questions were straightforward. Existing structure? Yes. Matching replacement? Yes. Expanding the footprint? No. New construction? No. I uploaded photographs of the damaged railing, a simple sketch showing identical dimensions, and the list of materials I planned to use. After submitting everything, I expected to wait several days before hearing anything. Instead, an automated confirmation email arrived within minutes, followed shortly afterward by another message requesting only one additional photograph of the porch support posts. I uploaded it immediately. Less than an hour later, another notification appeared in my inbox. My application had been reviewed. The repair qualified under the city's residential maintenance guidelines with documentation on file. If an inspector determined a site visit became necessary, they would contact me before work resumed. I read the email twice, then printed 2 copies. One went into my project folder. The other stayed on the dining table beside Linda's orange violation notice. The contrast between the 2 documents couldn't have been clearer. One contained precise language, official references, contact information, and applicable municipal code. The other relied almost entirely on broad warnings and undefined authority. As I placed them side by side, I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was beginning to understand the real issue. Linda wasn't just trying to stop my porch repair. She was acting as though the HOA had authority that actually belonged to the city. And somehow, I had a feeling she wasn't finished pushing the issue. Monday morning arrived with a quiet confidence I hadn't felt all weekend. I wasn't celebrating, but I also wasn't worried anymore. My project folder now contained printed copies of the city's maintenance guidelines, my online application confirmation, the approval email, photographs of the existing porch, and every HOA document I had reviewed. If anyone wanted to discuss the repair, I was ready to have that conversation with facts instead of assumptions. I carried the folder to the kitchen counter while my coffee brewed. The orange violation notice still sat beside the city's approval email, almost like 2 competing versions of reality. One relied on authority. The other relied on documentation. Around 10 that morning, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Brooks?" a woman asked after I answered. "This is Melissa from the city's building department. We received additional correspondence regarding your property. I immediately knew where this was going. Additional correspondence? I repeated. Yes, she replied politely. Someone contacted our office this morning requesting immediate enforcement action. They stated unauthorized construction was taking place without proper approval. I looked through the front window toward my unfinished porch and couldn't help smiling to myself. Linda hadn't accepted the city's involvement. She had tried to recruit it. I submitted everything through your online portal on Saturday, I explained. I received confirmation that my repair documentation had been accepted. Yes, Melissa answered before I could say anything else. I'm looking at your file now. Everything appears to be in order. However, because of the complaint, one of our inspectors will stop by tomorrow morning to verify the work matches your submission. There was no accusation in her voice. No warning. Just procedure. That works for me, I said. I'll be home. After we ended the call, I stepped outside to organize my tools. The porch remained exactly as I had left it. Lumber stacked neatly against the garage. Drill batteries charging on the workbench. Measurements still marked in pencil across several replacement boards. I wasn't trying to race ahead before the inspection. There was no reason to. About 20 minutes later, I noticed Linda walking slowly along the opposite sidewalk. She wasn't out for exercise. Her eyes remained fixed on my driveway. When she realized I had seen her, she crossed the street without hesitation. I hope you've made the right decision, she said before even saying good morning. Actually, I answered, I've been working with the city. Her expression barely changed, but I caught the smallest pause before she responded. The city doesn't override HOA rules. Maybe not, I replied calmly, but they do determine whether my repair is legally permitted. She folded her arms exactly as she had on Saturday. We'll see what the inspector says. There was something different about her confidence now. It sounded less certain, almost rehearsed. She turned and walked away before I could respond, disappearing toward the next block. Later that afternoon, I noticed two neighbors slowing near my driveway while walking their dog. They glanced at the unfinished porch, then quietly continued without saying anything. News traveled fast in neighborhoods like ours. By evening, almost everyone probably knew that the city had become involved. The difference was that most people assumed I should be nervous. Strangely enough, I wasn't. The inspection no longer felt like something to fear. It felt like the moment when opinions would finally be replaced by evidence. As I locked my toolbox for the night, I realized tomorrow wasn't really about my porch anymore. It was about discovering whether Linda's confidence could survive the arrival of someone whose authority didn't come from an HOA election. The next morning, I was already outside before 8. The air still carried the coolness of the night, and a thin layer of dew covered the grass along the sidewalk. My tools remained exactly where I had left them. Nothing had been touched. The unfinished porch looked frozen in time, waiting for someone other than the HOA to decide what happened next. At exactly 8:17, a white pickup truck with the city's building department logo turned slowly onto my street. It wasn't dramatic. There were no flashing lights or sirens. It looked like any other municipal vehicle performing routine work. Yet somehow, every curtain on the block seemed to shift at the same moment. Front doors opened just enough for curious neighbors to peek outside. A few people suddenly found reasons to check their mailboxes. Even Mr. Henderson appeared with another mug of coffee, pretending to admire the weather while keeping one eye on my driveway. The inspector stepped out carrying a tablet and a compact measuring tape. His name badge identified him as David Morales. He introduced himself with a firm handshake before asking to see the repair plans I had submitted online. I handed him the project folder without saying much. He appreciated organized paperwork, flipping through each page methodically instead of rushing. He compared the printed photographs to the actual porch, measured several sections of the existing railing, then crouched to examine the cracked support posts beneath the handrail. These are in worse condition than the photos suggested, he said quietly. I'm glad you reported them before somebody leaned against this. That single sentence erased any lingering doubt I had about replacing the railing. David continued making notes on his tablet while walking around the porch. He verified the dimensions, checked the spacing of the existing balusters, and confirmed that my replacement materials matched the original design almost exactly. There was no hint that he expected to issue a violation. Quite the opposite. He seemed pleased that the work had been documented before repairs began. We had just finished reviewing the final measurements when another familiar sound interrupted the quiet morning. High heels against concrete. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Linda approached from across the street, carrying the same black clipboard she seemed to take everywhere. Her pace was confident, but there was a noticeable urgency this time. "Good morning," she called toward the inspector before either of us spoke. "I'm Linda Foster, president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. I'm the one who reported this unauthorized construction." David looked up politely. "Good morning," he replied. "We're conducting a site verification." Linda pointed directly at my porch. This homeowner ignored an HOA stop order and attempted exterior construction without approval. She spoke as though the conclusion had already been reached. David glanced at me briefly before returning his attention to the tablet. "Sir," Linda continued, "our governing documents prohibit this kind of work without authorization from the Architectural Review Committee." The inspector didn't respond immediately. Instead, he tapped through several screens on his tablet, reviewing the application history attached to my address. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Finally, he looked up and asked Linda a question she clearly wasn't expecting. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "can you explain why your complaint described this as illegal construction?" Linda opened her mouth almost instantly, ready with another confident answer. But for the first time since this entire situation began, I noticed something different. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at the city inspector. And somehow, she suddenly seemed much less certain that the conversation was going to end the way she had planned. Linda straightened her shoulders before answering, as though confidence alone could outweigh documentation. "The association has standards that every homeowner agrees to follow," she said. He was instructed to stop, and instead he continued seeking approval somewhere else. David Morales listened without interrupting. He didn't nod. He didn't argue. He simply looked down at his tablet again before asking another quiet question. "Did your association issue a violation based on an adopted written rule?" Linda blinked once. "Our Architectural Review Committee oversees exterior work." "I understand," David replied. "I'm asking whether the restriction you cited is contained in your recorded governing documents or an adopted board policy." For the first time since she had stepped onto my driveway that Saturday morning, Linda didn't answer immediately. She shuffled through the papers clipped beneath her board, turning several pages as if the document might suddenly appear if she looked hard enough. The silence spread across the front yards. Even the neighbors pretending to trim hedges or water flowers had stopped moving. Finally, Linda spoke again. "It's an established community practice." David nodded politely, but his expression never changed. Community practices and municipal requirements are two different things. He turned toward me. "Mr. Brooks, your application, photographs, and repair description all match what I'm seeing on site." He tapped a few more notes into the tablet before continuing. "You're replacing deteriorated components with matching materials. You're not expanding the structure, changing the footprint, or creating a new addition." I simply listened. There was no reason to interrupt. The facts were speaking more clearly than I ever could. David looked back at Linda. "From the city's perspective, this repair has been properly documented. We have no basis to issue a stop work order." Linda's jaw tightened. "So the HOA has no authority?" she asked, her voice noticeably sharper now. "I didn't say that," David answered calmly. "Associations may enforce their governing documents through their own procedures, but they cannot represent municipal enforcement where none exists, and they cannot ask this department to stop lawful work without a valid code issue." The distinction landed harder than any argument could have. Several neighbors exchanged quick glances across the street. Mr. Henderson quietly lowered his coffee mug again. David continued reviewing the file one final time before scrolling to another section I hadn't seen. "There's one additional note attached to your address," he said, mostly to himself. He paused for a second, then looked at Linda. "This isn't the first complaint submitted from this location." She frowned. "What do you mean?" David turned the tablet slightly so both of us could see the screen. A list of previous reports appeared, each with a date, disposition, and short description. Fence replacement, tree trimming, exterior paint, roof maintenance. Every complaint had been marked with nearly identical conclusions. No municipal violation found. I recognized one address after another. They all belonged to homes on my street. David sighed quietly. It appears we've responded to multiple requests over the past 18 months involving this neighborhood. None resulted in enforcement action. Linda immediately tried to explain. We were simply protecting community standards. David didn't challenge her. He only locked the tablet and slipped it into his case. My responsibility is applying city code consistently, he said. Based on today's inspection, Mr. Brooks may proceed with his repair as submitted. Then he handed me a printed inspection summary from his truck. I accepted it with a simple thank you. There was no victory speech, no celebration, just one official document replacing a weekend full of assumptions. As David walked back toward his truck, Linda remained standing at the edge of my driveway, staring at the paper in my hand. For the first time since this conflict began, she wasn't holding the strongest document in the conversation. And judging by the look on her face, she had just realized everyone on the street had witnessed that change. After the city truck disappeared around the corner, the neighborhood seemed unusually quiet. It wasn't the comfortable silence of an ordinary weekday morning. It was the kind that follows when everyone has witnessed the same event and no one quite knows how to talk about it yet. Linda remained standing near the sidewalk for another few seconds, her clipboard tucked tightly against her chest. She looked toward the inspection summary still resting in my hand, then turned without another word and walked back across the street. The confident stride she had carried onto my driveway had disappeared. I watched her unlock her front door and step inside, closing it more gently than I had ever seen before. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I picked up my tape measure, positioned the first replacement railing in place, and went back to work. The familiar sound of a drill echoed across the yard. This time, nobody told me to stop. By early afternoon, something subtle had begun to change around the neighborhood. People no longer slowed down to stare as though they expected another confrontation. Instead, several neighbors simply waved as they passed. Mr. Henderson wandered over carrying another mug of coffee. He stood quietly beside the porch for a moment before speaking. Looks like the city answered the question. I smiled. I guess they did. He nodded toward the fresh inspection paperwork lying safely inside a clear plastic sleeve on my workbench. Sometimes paperwork speaks louder than arguments. That was probably the truest sentence I'd heard all week. Before heading home, he added something else. You're not the first person who's had problems. I looked up from tightening a bolt. What do you mean? He shrugged. Most people just don't push back. They pay the fine, delay the project, or assume the board knows the law better than they do. His words stayed with me long after he walked away. I thought about the list David had briefly shown us on his tablet. Fence repairs, roof, maintenance, tree trimming, different homes, different projects. The same result every time. No municipal violation. Suddenly my situation felt much less personal. It wasn't simply about my porch anymore. It was about a pattern that had quietly shaped how people behaved in the neighborhood. Later that evening, I checked my mailbox and found an envelope from the HOA. For a brief moment, I wondered whether another violation notice had arrived. Instead, it contained a short letter informing me that my scheduled compliance hearing had been postponed until further notice. No explanation, no apology, just one sentence acknowledging that additional review was underway. I folded the letter and placed it beside the city's inspection summary. Once again, the contrast was impossible to ignore. One document confirmed facts. The other quietly stepped away from accusations that had sounded so certain only days earlier. As the sun began to set, the fresh cedar boards reflected a warm golden color across the porch. I installed another section of railing and tightened the final screws before cleaning my tools. Across the street, Linda briefly appeared behind her living room curtains. Our eyes met for only a second before she let the curtain fall closed again. She didn't wave. She didn't glare. She simply disappeared from the window. For someone who had always seemed eager to supervise everyone else's property, the silence felt strangely unfamiliar. I realized then that I hadn't defeated anyone. The city inspector hadn't embarrassed Linda. I hadn't argued louder than she had. The documents had simply removed opinion from the conversation. And once the facts became visible to everyone, authority alone was no longer enough to control the outcome. The only thing left unfinished was my porch, and for the first time since this entire conflict began, finishing it seemed like the easiest part of the story. 2 weeks later, the porch was finished. Fresh cedar railings framed the front steps exactly the way the originals had years before weather and time had worn them down. The stain had dried into a warm honey color that caught the afternoon sunlight, and every board sat square, level, and secure. If someone had never seen the old railing, they probably would have assumed nothing had changed at all. That was the point. It had never been about building something new. It had always been about taking care of what already belonged there. I carried the last of my tools into the garage and stood quietly for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. A lawn mower hummed somewhere down the block. Wind moved gently through the maple trees that gave our subdivision its name. Everything felt ordinary again, and somehow that ordinary silence felt more satisfying than any dramatic victory could have. A few days after the inspection, another envelope had arrived from the HOA. This one was noticeably thinner than the first. Inside was a single-page notice stating that my violation had been withdrawn following further review. There was no admission that the original accusation had been incorrect. There was no apology for the public confrontation on my driveway. There was simply a sentence confirming that no additional enforcement action would be taken regarding my porch repair. I read it once before filing it away with the city's inspection summary, the online approval confirmation, and the photographs I had taken before the project began. Together, they told the complete story far better than memory ever could. Life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. People still waved while walking their dogs. Mr. Henderson occasionally stopped by to admire the finished railing, though I suspected he enjoyed our conversations more than the porch itself. One Saturday morning he smiled and said, "Funny thing about facts. They don't need to raise their voices." I laughed because he was right. Across the street, Linda became noticeably quieter. She still attended HOA meetings and still walked the neighborhood from time to time with her familiar clipboard, but something had changed. She no longer stopped homeowners in the middle of simple maintenance projects. She no longer stood in driveways issuing immediate demands. Whether that change came from the inspection, the withdrawn violation, or the realization that neighbors had watched everything unfold, I couldn't say. Honestly, it no longer mattered. One afternoon our paths crossed while collecting the mail. She glanced briefly toward my completed porch before looking back at her mailbox. "The railing looks nice," she said softly. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a conversation. But it was the first time she had spoken to me without trying to exercise authority. "Thank you," I replied. She nodded once and walked home. That was all either of us needed to say. Looking back now, I sometimes think the biggest lesson had very little to do with homeowners associations or permits. It was about the difference between confidence and proof. Linda had relied on certainty. I had relied on documentation. She believed repeating a claim made it true. I discovered that the truth doesn't become stronger because someone speaks louder. It becomes stronger because it can be verified. My porch still stands exactly where I rebuilt it. Every time I walk up those steps, I remember that weekend when a simple home repair turned into something much larger. I never wanted to embarrass anyone. I never wanted a public confrontation. I simply wanted the chance to maintain my own home without being told rules existed when they didn't. In the end, the city never shut Linda down with dramatic speeches or punishment. It did something far more powerful. It quietly applied the law exactly as written. And sometimes, the strongest answer isn't winning an argument. It's calmly finishing the work that was always yours to do.